Hello, and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer. And I'm Anna Isabel, a psychological astrologer. And I'm very delighted to have Penny Thornton here with me today. Hello, Penny.
Hello,
Welcome.
Anna. Good to meet you.
And you. And I've been reading your book, The Forces of Destiny, and really enjoying it. So it might be good as a starting point for you to tell us a little bit about the book.
Yes, absolutely. And this is interesting because, of course, I wrote this book in 1989. That's rather a long time ago. So it's kind of, I won't say it's gathered dust on my shelves because it hasn't. It's been quite a successful book, but I don't look at it. So I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to talk about this book. I better get it out. So I got it out this afternoon and sort of went through it. I was absolutely surprised to find some of it was quite good. Some of it was really rather good, in fact. And I remember at the time, you know, when I decided to write this book, which sort of came out of an experience that I'd had giving birth to my second child, which sort of transformed me. I had Pluto on the ascendant at that time, and I nearly lost him at 20 weeks. So I was in hospital, lying flat on a bed until he finally decided he wanted to come in, which was about 8 weeks later. He was, you know, he was 28 weeks, 27 weeks and 5 days when he was born. And his birth was the transforming moment for me because I had decided in my mind that he was so fragile. I remember this was back in the early 80s, you know, and I thought that he might not survive. So I thought the best thing to do would be to disengage from the whole birth experience and just, you know, get on with it. And so he was born in the early hours of the morning. And I'd gone back to my room, wheeled back to my room, and I thought, I'm just not going to see this child. I'm just going to have to detach. Anyway, by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I had this overwhelming sense. He's your child. If he lives 2 hours or 100 years, you love him. You have to connect with this little small piece of life. And so I remember ringing the bell and, you know, being taken up in a chair to the intensive care, you know, the natal intensive care. And as the doors were open, I was being wheeled by this nurse. As the doors opened, there was a little incubator sort of facing the doors, and there was this little tiny little person in there with a little woolly hat on, and he looked at me. He engaged immediately with my eyes, and this smile lit up his face. Now I turned to the nurse and I said, can you see, is he smiling at me? And she had tears in her eyes. We were crying because it was like he knew me. And that definitely changed my whole approach to life. And there'd been lots of other things to do with that long stay in hospital. So I had this book incubating about life and death and reincarnation and past lives and present experiences. And finally, I started to write it just a couple of years later. And in this book, which I explored reincarnation and the various belief systems, I looked at all sorts of psychological aspects of, you know, past trauma, all that kind of thing. Fate, the subject of fate. I also decided I wanted to see if there could be a relationship between one life and the next. Wouldn't it surely show up in a horoscope, so that if I had a horoscope of a past life and a present life, would I be able to see the threads between those two charts? So I thought, well, how am I going to get this? You know, what am I going to do? So I was talking to people about wanting to make this project work. And somebody knew this psychiatrist at Guy's Hospital who was very interested in the whole idea of regression with hypnotherapy. And so I met him and he talked about it, and he was very willing to embark on this study with me. He was in control of everything. He chose all the people on the study that he wished to work with, because he didn't want to work with people who were, you know, kind of mentally ill. he wanted to have healthy people. And so we conducted or put together this approach where he would regress each of those individuals through 3 lives on 3 very different occasions. And what we did on each of those was not only to go through the motions of where are you, what time is it, are you being born, the whole of the birth process, and then trying to establish what time they were born and where they were born. But we also took them beyond death, so that at the death moment, we would discover what happened in that space. And that turned out to be the most extraordinary level of, illumination, call it what you want. It was fascinating. So this study went on, while I was writing the book. And then eventually all the tapes came to me and I went through all of them. It took a long time, quite a lot of tapes to listen to, and to also draw up charts, whether they were born in the Elizabethan times, or there were some times that were quite difficult, but with software programs, we were able to somehow get to Arabia as it was, wherever. And it was exciting to work with it and to sort of see the connections and explore them. So sometime after that, I met all 22 of those people who'd had these 3 past life experiences. And in my own mind, I had thought, doesn't prove that there was a past life, or there even is such a thing as a past life. But what the point was that the transformation that they experienced in their current lives, they absolutely, one woman was a totally transformed human being. She had been unable to communicate with her mother and her had this terrible relationship. But the one past life had illuminated what was going on. And she was now able to talk to her mother. So there were things like this going on. And I thought to myself, it didn't really matter whether the subconscious mind and the imagination were working together in order to fabricate something that would allow the process of transformation to occur. I didn't think it really mattered whether it was a genuine past life or it wasn't, but absolutely all of the people on the study genuinely believed they had lived those lives. There was not a scintilla of doubt.
No, there wouldn't be. I think my experience of working with past life regressions is that it's an incredibly profound way to work. And sometimes it's interesting because sometimes when there are times when it happens spontaneously. So I think I'm doing a past life. I think I'm doing a normal, as in bog standard hypnotherapy session where we're exploring issues from this life, and suddenly I'm hearing things that are not what I would expect. And I realize that we've stumbled into a past life. And very often this is people who are not necessarily interested in reincarnation. And it's, so that's one thing. But the other thing is that whether it's by intent or accidentally, whenever we stumble onto or deliberately regress into a past life, it's always a profound experience. And sometimes the client comes out of it and they are a little bit unsure of what to make of it. It takes them a little while to process. But most often in those instances where they're a little bit confused and unsure, a few weeks later, some very profound but subtle changes have happened. So on the surface, nothing's changed, but internally, perspectives have changed. New understandings have been gained. It's always very profound. And I love looking at the chart because the chart always mirrors it. So what I've realized is that these amazing charts that we have are not just symbolically representing our present life, but that the past is written in it too. This is not our chart as in this lifetime. This is our soul's story. And
well, I would agree with all of that. And the add-on after this was that because this had had such a profound effect on me, I thought, right, I've got to do hypnotherapy. I've got to train. So I did a whole kind of course in hypnotherapy and psychotherapy, and came out of that with the intention of working with my clients in this way, because it was such a wonderful way to get to core experiences and to change their lives, to produce change in people in their lives is a great gift to be able to give. But my career took a big divergent, it diverged. So I never did that. But the interesting thing is that 2 years ago, I started to work with my clients in a way in which I was using the natal chart, and at least certainly one area of the natal chart, to dig very deep into history. And this has produced, it's been like walking or moving into a whole different room with astrology, and with the effects on my clients who initially, when it was perhaps mentioned something about in their family history, they would ignore it or reject it or say, no, this hasn't, no. And I would then leave it with them. And the next thing I know, they've picked it up and run with the ball and gone through it. And so this process of uncovering the past is also, it's a powerful process, whichever way you come at it,
Exactly. It's not all my clients come to me for therapy. Many of them want to understand themselves better, and they want to use astrology to do that. And so to read the chart at that level gives such a deep insight, and it's a very challenging, sometimes we have to be careful because it's a very challenging experience in a way, but always it is incredibly significant and powerful. So I guess then the next thing is to get to the nuts and bolts of the astrology behind it. And so tell us about how you go about discerning history in a chart.
Oh gosh, that's such a big question. Well, what I do is it's a conversation. It's not a lecture. And because I might be opening up some great dark vat, I move gingerly around the subject. So first of all, I will talk about the idea of past lives, and I will sort of say, there's no proof that we have past lives. It makes a certain amount of sense that, we have several lifetimes in order to evolve. Makes sense, and no proof. But what we almost certainly do is that we do have a living past, so to speak, in our gene bank. And we are bringing from generation to generation, not just the fact we have blue eyes, or we can dance, or we can write, or all these things that seem to be passed from generation to generation, but we also bring through memories and histories that come from our past. Now, there's quite a lot of interesting research going on in this. And one of the more recent research programs, which was about looking at before the baby is conceived, if there'd been a traumatic experience before conception, the brain of the mother, if you like, or maybe even the father, they're both involved, has triggered, it's like a scar, a reaction. There is a definite, scar on that, for that experience. And what they discovered was that the baby has the scar too, so that that experience, even if it's not in living memory, is somehow within the psyche, within the memory. So this is quite a good basis for understanding that as we come through and we look back at our ancestry, and how often do grandparents say, oh, you were just like your great-great-grandmother. You look like her. She could do that. You know, so we have the idea of patterning, but more than that, if we start to look at difficulties in the life or things that seem to be repeating patterns, and we start to look at those in terms of the family history and the history that they may know about, or they can research if they're able to go back. We have all these wonderful gene companies now that will take you back generations, so you do have a sort of plan. The process of uncovering that suddenly made the experiences that they were running into, the patterns that they'd noticed themselves, suddenly had a purpose, have a purpose, and that in sort of understanding that the role they're playing isn't just this happened to me and so I'm dealing with it, but the idea that where you come from, all this long history, past, you are doing this for your family. I mean, that's perhaps a little simplistic, but it suddenly started to make a lot of sense. And with one of my clients, who I may well have talked about on the talk I did for the lodge, was her family had a history of not bankruptcy, but that they were all bankers. You know, they'd been bankers, you know, back way high, you know, whenever it was. And when I started to talk about the military and talked about anger and sudden death, and of course you can hear this is all related to Mars somehow, sudden death, anger, and you know, with Mars in Aries, I think. And she said to me, no, I can't really relate to that. But anyway, I planted the seed. So she thought, right, I'm going to look at this. And the trail that went to of accidental death by one great grandparent, a random accident. The father, the great grandfather, was driving the car. They got stuck on the rail lines and the train went into the car, killing her great grandmother, or what it was. We had suicides. Drastic deaths. As she went back, she saw this terrible pattern of often self-destruction more than anything else. And so when I engaged her and I said, well, what about you? Have you ever had a moment when you contemplated suicide? So she looked at me and she said, well, I didn't really want to talk about this. But I've been in therapy over this because right until the age of 40, I had several episodes of, you know, wanting to commit suicide. I was very angry and depressed and was treated for it. And so she moved on from there because I must have opened some other doorway that she could get into. And I talked about, I think, violence within the sense of, because you're putting these ideas out. You're not saying, I know this happened to you. You're saying, could it be? I have a feeling there's something here I've seen before. And this often crops up in a situation where there is persecution, you know, and so that leaves the ball open. And she said, and it came much later, this was over several weeks. This wasn't just one session. She said to me, I don't know why, I haven't told you this before, but one of the reasons I went into therapy was not about, you know, the suicidal moments that I felt, but that I had a persistent dream that would crop up all the time. And I was always being chased. I was being chased by the Nazis or the redcoats. And she said, it was a terrible experience. I would wake up screaming because I was being chased. And she said on one of these dreams, and this was in a Nazi Germany or wherever she was in her dream, she was not only chased by this Nazi officer, but raped by him. And she said when she looked into his eyes in the dream, she saw her mother. So this was such a powerful moment because we have the connection with the mother. And, you know, of course, we're all taught to love our mothers and we expect to love our mothers. And so when we don't love our mothers, it's a terrible thing. We feel guilty, we don't love our mother. But for her, this, you know, this connection between all the things that have been unpicked layer by layer started to, of course, once you've named and shamed it or whatever you want to call it, there is this kind of understanding. I won't call it a release. I will simply call it an understanding. And on top of this, she then felt that her role was to bring an end to this cycle of destruction and persecution and violent death. She felt this was her responsibility. And just before he died, her father had said to her, it wasn't very long ago before we started to work together, he had said to her, thank goodness you're the end of the line. We can put an end to this, because she didn't have any children of her own. And isn't that an incredible story, really? But it's a journey in making sense of it all.
Indeed. And I think the word that we're looking for here is context, because I talk about this often. Our society, our culture is one of individualism. And we are encouraged to look at a person as an individual, and yet that individual exists within a context. It's within a history, it's within a family that has history. And we know absolutely that all the studies that have been done on the children of Holocaust survivors and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, that the trauma is passed on. We could not have evolution if we didn't have some sort of coded transfer of experiences at a genetic level, because how else does a rabbit know to fear a fox?
Of course, exactly.
You know, it makes absolute sense. And what we're talking here about here is how the chart helps us to put the individual into a family context. You know, we're always looking at the family dynamics in a chart, relationship dynamics, etc. But that's what that is. It's putting the individual into a context. And now we're talking further about putting them into a historical context. And of course, if we're talking about it from a karmic perspective, the context of the soul's story. So it's layers. What we're talking about is layers and layers that do help, because when it takes away that feeling of randomness, and also a feeling like you're a victim of circumstance. Understanding that there's a context suddenly becomes very empowering.
It is empowering is a very good word. I would use that. But just working with my clients in this way and really seeing their joy in that connection, that sense of empowerment. It's not freeing. I think freeing is the wrong word, but I think empowerment is probably a very good word. And you know, and it's very powerful for you as the facilitator in a way, or as the person who's pressing the buttons and opening the doors and saying, go through that door, see what you find. And that's also very illuminating for you as an astrologer who learns every time you see a chart or you see a situation. It becomes, oh my goodness, it's your path too. We never stop, or we should never stop growing and learning and discovering, you know, as astrologers.
Because not only are we acting as gentle guides into the investigation.
I see where you're coming from. You're a gentle guide. I don't know what I am. I'm not sure I'm so gentle.
But, well, but we're also witnessing. And that is also in itself a very powerful thing to do, because if you are working at this deep level, which is therapeutic, your witnessing means that you are holding that person as they're going through this and making it safe for them to do so, and helping them
Perfect.
then to
Wonderful.
come healing.
Absolutely.
And so it's an incredibly privileged and humble position to be in. Because you're witnessing
yes,
incredibly personal and delicate. And that's why I said gentle guide, because it is a very delicate process that you are witnessing, and you're not doing it, the client's doing it, but what you're doing is you're acting as a catalyst to help them do it. And that's really important.
Yes, it is. All those things are so true. And I don't know who, as you say, there are probably other people doing this work. But when you come upon it, as I came upon it, it was not by knowing about it so much as having it occur, even though obviously it's been built on years and years and years of experience and study and observation and all those things. But when you first start moving into it, it's like it is a new place for you. It's opening up some new worlds for you. And the story I have, which is it always makes me smile a bit, having been doing this work for about 2 years, I think, more or less, and feeling my way a little bit with whether people were prepared to go that far or they wanted to, checking it. I started work with a new client 2 or 3 months ago. And normally I will go through the chart and talk about things on a very, not exactly superficial level, but just getting, broken in. And I'd only been working for 5 minutes when I said something. Just obviously I was already in the 4th house, so to speak. I'd already gone straight to the 4th house within 5 minutes. And she said to me, "Oh, I'm hearing my ancestors' voices all the time now. They're calling to me." And I thought, wow, we don't even need to pussyfoot around this. She wants to know what the ancestors are saying.
So now you mentioned the 4th house, and now we're getting to what I call the nuts and bolts of it. Because as you've been talking, we could only be assuming that you're talking about the 4th house.
Indeed.
So tell us about how you see the 4th house and what you feel it reveals to you.
Yeah, well, the 4th house, I mean, I think all the houses, I mean, again, I'm writing another book now on all the houses, because my view of, the mutable houses, I call them the seeking houses. These are the houses of seeking. The thing they have in common is that they're all about seeking. So I have all these new kind of developments on those same themes. So the 4th house, I was thinking you need to look at it like it's going deep, it goes down, 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 down. There is no end to the 4th house. It's just this little piece of cake that goes all the way down, bottomless, and has all sorts of layers. It can represent the home you live in, the family you come from, your background. It can explain the kind of family life you have, your domestic circumstances. It can describe all those things that are essential parts of everybody's life. Where is my home? What is my address? Who are my parents? Who are my children? And so on. So we can look at it on that. I take it a little bit deeper, because you can't necessarily isolate the Imam Kohli, the IC from the MC. They're just one end of the same chain. So basically, the 4th house is also the foundations of the future, because depending upon the background you've had, your upbringing, your experience of growing up, you grow up with certain ideas of who you want to be, where you want to go in life, how you want to build your life from the foundations of where you began. So there we have 4th house again. So then we go a little bit deeper and we start to think about what goes beyond your mother and your father. Oh, well, there's your 2 sets of grandparents, and then there's 4 sets of great grandparents. You know, you go on now, deep into the cellar, or beyond the cellar. We've gone through the cellar floor now. We're into, you know, the deep ground of the 4th house, where in lies our grandparents and great-great-grandparents and so on, as far as you want to go, their stories, their presence, their influence, their experience, memories, genes coming through you. So this has to be, and it is, if you look at the horoscope, I've even drawn out a little image, which I didn't eventually use because I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. But I drew a tree. I do a tree with the roots going down, 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 down. And at the other end on the MC, we've got the branches, and on the side, we've got, you know, myself, the horizon, you know, whatever. So this idea of your tree of life is really represented by the MCIC axis, and also the ascendant descendant axis in there. It's all one big axis. But the roots are everything, because if your roots aren't nourished, if they're damaged, if they get damaged, then the tree can't grow properly. And it's the thing is, if we look at this idea that when you are aware of what stories are coming through, what patterns are coming through from, you know, your ancestors, your, you know, back there, that you have a responsibility to the generations coming after you. Because this has come up and perhaps needs to be brought into awareness, if nothing else, all you do is put a light on it and you don't do anything else. You are helping the whole tree of life, your family life, to grow healthily.
It is in fact the image I always have of the 4th house. And when I'm teaching, I say, these are your roots. And it's, you know, it's deep. These are your roots, and you have to know your roots. I think, you know, again, it's an issue of context, because history is treated as though it's irrelevant very often in our culture now. And it is not irrelevant. It is the context of our culture. And when you look at that on a personal level, every idea that you have as a child about who you are and the world that it's in comes from somewhere. And we might be thinking, oh, it's parents and maybe siblings and grandparents. But where did they get theirs? Okay, they get it through their own life experience. But the foundation of that goes deeper because it came from somewhere else. It's a belief system which has been created. And we know, for instance, in linguistic terms, that families have their own idiosyncratic language. These are, you know, sub-dialects, if you like, because people play with language. You know, there are certain family traits, you know, that people will say, oh, you know, this is what our family does. This is what we do at Christmas. This is because we are very creative as a species. And we innovate and we play with words, we play with ideas. So that just shows the richness of a culture that's there.
I think it might also explain why, which seems to be very common in India, that you get these small babies or young children who are fluent in a language that's not spoken by any of the family. Perhaps that's a bit of a stretch, but you know, things like that can be understood in the context of this kind of transmission of information and memory and experience, really.
If you are in a culture where reincarnation is accepted, when your child does something or is expressing a memory which doesn't belong in this particular lifetime, you're going to say, oh, that's another life. And you might even go so far as to explore it with the child. And there are so many examples of this. so many. But if you are in our culture, which rejects it outright, then that's a very different experience. When the child remembers something, they're going to shut it down. Now, I have yet to explore this, but I have a very distinct memory of a dream. I think I may have been about 4 years old, no older than 5. I was very little. And I remember saying to my mom, when are we going to that place where we travel around the city by boat? And my mom said to me, we've never been to such a place. I said, yeah, we have. I remember we were there. And so now Amsterdam, Venice, I don't know. I should at some point get around to exploring this, but I have always remembered it because I was curious. I wanted to know what this place was. And of course, as I grew up, I discovered, I learned about Venice and I learned about Amsterdam, and it's always been there in the back of my mind before I knew anything about reincarnation. So one day I imagine I'll get round to exploring this, but it's that kind of thing. Now, if my mom had said to me, oh, well, maybe we need to find, what else do you remember?
Yes. How interesting. That would have been very, very interesting.
Can you remember anything else about it? Who knows?
Yeah, coming back again to my personal experience, I grew up really as a child very fascinated with mystery, and at a very comparatively early age, was always fascinated by the idea that, there's that old woodcut of the man peering through the curtain and the stars are. That for me was what I felt like. I wanted to draw the veil back and get to know what all this meant. And it was a very early age when I was thinking these things. And my mother used to say to me, oh, you're just like your grandmother. You're just like your grandmother. But I didn't discover until not recently, but probably, about 20 years ago. But I mean, long gone, my grandmother, that she was in fact a theosophist, and she was, she went to all sorts of meetings and she knew all these people. I'm not saying she, knew Helena Blavatsky, but she did know, because I came across an old photograph. It was a newspaper cutting, and there is my grandmother with one of the famous theosophists who I've forgotten now, but in somehow her, and we never talked about it, of course, because my grandmother died when I was about 10. So, we would never have a conversation. But yet I ended up really carrying through this deep knowledge and experience and curiosity about it. And you can't say to me that wasn't passed on, because it would be completely random to think this little 8-year-old, 10-year-old girl suddenly starting to get very interested in drawing the veil back. What?
So there it is, the importance of the fourth house.
Yes.
The real importance of the fourth house. So
one other thing that comes to mind here is that I did a seminar for the Kepler College, and it was talking about the art of distillation, which was about reducing a charge to its essential details. You could reduce it to one thing, and I showed how you could do this, as I'm very keen on that. It's something I'm keen on, simplification, but it's not quite simplification, it's distillation, really. So really and truly, you could just do an entire session, or many hundreds of sessions, on what the fourth house has to tell you.
Indeed. So now I can completely understand that. There are times when a particular area of the chart takes up the kind of hijacks the session, because it's a very rich vein to mine. So we're talking about the fourth house, which obviously is going to have certain parallels with the moon. So how do you use the moon then?
Well, I mean, in a funny kind of way, the whole of your chart is the story of your past. I mean, I think I even said that in Astrology and Reincarnation. You can't just say Saturn is the planet of karma, because hello, the whole thing is karmic. But I would build on the story, you know, but I wouldn't necessarily look at the moon all on its own to tell us a great story about our past. Having said that, I realize how ridiculous it is to say that. It is probably part of the story, but there's so much information in the fourth house, and going through all of that, the fourth house ruler, what the connections are, you know, that's enough on its own to give you everything. So I'm not sure. I mean, you may have other ideas, and it's an evolving picture. So, you know,
it's, you know, it's the symphony, isn't it? And it's all of the, everything is a part of it. And yes, I think if we're looking at family and memory, you know, we can't ignore the moon. But a chart being a chart, we know the important themes crop up in many different guises in the chart. They're repeated, and you will see the echoes out.
I have a moon in Scorpio. My mother was a Scorpio. I have Pluto on the midheaven. which way do we want to say the same thing?
Exactly. And so the themes are there. Now, you've, if we can update things a little bit.
Come out of the fourth house. Take the elevator up.
You have also got something else here. You've got the astrology handbook.
I do. I even have a copy of my own book here.
Indeed.
Just in case
so
a key question I can't remember the answer to.
So what is it about this guide to interpretation that stands out for you?
Well, it's an evolution. In that, you know, I'm teaching my pupils and living with their problems and issues with getting to understand astrology, and also remembering my own development from knowing nothing to being a student and getting my faculty certificate and then my diploma, you know, how long it took to really sort of get to grips with it. And even then, when I had my diploma, it was like, you know, before I saw a client, I had to do 2 hours work, kind of figuring out every aspect. It was tortuous. So, and I think one can lose enthusiasm very early on, because to begin with, you're very enthusiastic about learning astrology. Oh, I'm going to know how, and then by the time you've gone through the planets and you think, oh gosh, what? You know, it's like there's so much information. I'm on information overload. I don't know how to deal with this, because I'm supposed to have the rising, you know, the sun rising, and yet at the same time, it's in this detriment. It's, you know, where do we go from here? So first of all, I would give my students little sheets, if you like, of things when what we'd worked on in class, and then what was going to help them through their homework. So, you know, this is all an evolving thing. And then my partner had been watching some astrology things, and he said, hey, you know, there's a really interesting person over in Los Angeles. She's done a little video about how to interpret a natal chart in 19 minutes. And he said, you must look at it. Surely you can do something like this. So I looked at this video, and it's a sweet kind of Asian young woman. And she was delightful. She was pointing out things, but from a non-astrological point of view. She said, look, I don't really know this, but I'm so fascinated by it. This is what this is, and this is who I am. And I thought, well, it was refreshing. It was lovely. And she sort of gave me this feeling that we should be able to put astrology across and a horoscope across in a fairly short space of time. We don't need to spend 2 hours trying to tell somebody what a horoscope is. So I set myself this challenge in 19 minutes to take you through how to read a birth chart, which was great fun. And it was done. And I managed to do it in not 15 minutes, 19 minutes. And then I thought, oh, but I really ought to have some notes with this, because it's all very well to say this is the midheaven and blah, blah, blah. I really need to sort of explain exactly what that really means. So I started writing notes to put in the box accompanying the YouTube video. So by the time I'd sort of got endless notes, I thought, you know what? You know what's going to be easier here is if I put a PDF together, and then people can download a PDF. Well, by the time I got to page 70 of the PDF, I thought, you know, this isn't a PDF. This is a book.
I'll tell you what cured me
And
our preps, doing phone-ins on radio with people asking me to answer specific questions that they were asking about their charts. I have never learned more quickly, and I have nothing taught me to be succinct and precise better than that experience.
You are so right. And I would say that about my years doing such a lot of sun sign stuff. And I remember being an astrologer for, you know, and writing a daily horoscope, but really doing it the best I could. And, you know, watching the movements of the planets every single day. My goodness, what a discipline you've got. It was
exactly, yeah.
amazing.
And you really get a sense of the feel of the moment. You're capturing the zeitgeist, so to speak, because you're understanding the interplay happening.
And yes, and so it's very good to be able to speak to people who don't know astrology. I mean, I've sat in lectures, in astrological conferences, and listened to somebody talking about that, you know, would look at a chart and say, you see what I mean? Venus square Saturn. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Tell me. And everybody would go, oh, hello, explain it. Tell us what that is. So, you know, that's very much my approach, but particularly with the astrology handbook, this idea of losing enthusiasm as a student, as a beginner, it's very important to be able to say something about a chart right away. The first time you look at a chart, say something about it. What's the easiest way of looking at that? Doing that, looking at the patterns, looking at the shapings, the hemispheres. They're just an instant picture. You don't even have to know what the planets are or what they mean. You're just looking at a pattern. And that's a way in. You can talk quite a lot about, you know, what we might call a bowl shaping in all the planets. It gives you a real dimension of somebody's character or somebody's, you know, all sorts of things. You can build on it as much as you like. So there are kind of 9 stages in this book where, you know, you go from looking at the patterns and you build up, and then you learn about the planets and how they work, and how the planets really are the great actors in this great horoscopic drama. The signs are the clothes they fit in sometimes. You know, I'm playing Othello, this is what I wear. You know, I'm in the 2nd house, you know. So it's getting to be very, 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 very familiar with the planets. Everything is contained in the story of the planets. Another big chunk of the stages of, you know, 9 stages are the elements and the qualities, because these two very interestingly give you a certain dynamic about this person. You know, mainly fiery. My goodness, we know what fire is. We know it's like fire. It's all over the place. It's warm, it's hot, it's, you know, uncontainable sometimes. And then we know about earth, you know, down to earth, solid. Let's get this straight. Let's not run before we can walk. So you've got some basic temperamental types in there without going very much further into the really more complex factors, especially the aspects and the dynamics that bring planets and, you know, the whole thing together.
And I like that. I like that approach, because having been a teacher myself and still teaching astrology, I think it's really very important, as you say, for people to not lose heart. And the way that you do that is you allow them to have easy wins as a means of motivating, to say, yeah, you can do this. That's a very important part of teaching, is to help students succeed so that their confidence grows and that they are then willing to continue and delve more. So it's a really lovely approach. you have to, you know, when you're looking at a chart, you have to pick a thread. Sometimes it doesn't matter what thread you're picking, but you pick a thread so that the whole thing begins then to unravel. And once people understand that, once my students understand that, actually just pick a thread, and then things begin to
fall into place. And
it's
very
a good
good.
thing.
Yeah.
So your book is very helpful because it allows people to see the different threads that they might pick.
And I think also fairly early on, and certainly in the introduction, I talk about, where does your eye go? Where are you drawn? Because astrology is arid without any kind of intuitive function. So you've got to also develop your eye for what's important. And of course, I didn't mention this in the introduction because I don't want to take too far. But of course, looking at the same chart 10 years later, maybe coming at it, maybe not for the first time, but it's been 10 years, your eye will go somewhere else because that's what's relevant. So yeah, and there was something else I wanted to say about this. Yeah, I think my concept, as I turned my notes and my PDF eventually into a book on interpretation, was that I have a much bigger vision of an astrology handbook that can be read in different parts: the houses, synastry, transits and progressions, prediction. It's all going to be the astrology handbook, done in parts. But I think what I didn't want to do, and what was, and this is why I didn't do it in the guide to interpretation, was to give you everything. Mars in the first house, Mars in the second house, Mars in the third house. No, I'm not going to do that in this book, because when we get to the houses of the horoscope, there we're going to find out how Mars operates in all 12 houses, how Pluto operates in all 12 houses. So that's coming later. But, you know, I think if people think this is a cookbook, it's not a cookbook, but it is an absolute, you should have it in your pocket if you're coming to interpretation, or even if you're pretty adept at it, just a little bit of a reminder about, you know what, that's,
well, you know, I think that the definition of a handbook is a book that actually fits in your hand. Yes. And certainly does fit in the hand. So I think just a reminder to our audience, the two books that we have been discussing today are The Forces of Destiny and The Astrology Handbook, Part 1, Guides to Interpretation. Penny, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been a delight, and I would like to go on talking to you. It's a lot of, it's not just fun, because that makes it seem as though it's lighthearted, and we haven't been lighthearted, but it's innovate. No, it's not innovating, it's energizing.
Energizing because of stimulating, and I would love to have you back as soon as your book is finished, and we can talk some more, and that would be fabulous. Penny, thank you very, very much for your time today. If people wanted to get in touch with you, how could they do that?
Well, they just go to astrolutely.com. They can just Google Penny Thornton, and, you know, my website will come up, and you can contact me via there. Very easy.
Wonderful. I shall put that on the description box along with links to the books.
Thank you. And also my YouTube channel, you know, which is now, I haven't been doing it very long, I've been growing it. And I am looking at all sorts of interesting aspects of astrology. It has got some general things in it, but, you know, that's another place to go if you're really...
Fabulous. Wonderful.
Right.
Well, I'd like to thank you once again, and to thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, do please feel free to write them, and I will always reply. Until next time, goodbye.